reach across time and see yourself. You stand tall against terrifying enemies. You build masterpieces and break down barriers. You rush into the future and meet your past. For every time, at every moment, the official network of every millennium. The History Channel, where the past comes alive.
In the late 80s, someone in the Seattle, Washington area was putting cyanide in Excedrin.
It was a very weird thing to go through, this idea that anything that we're taking, we're drinking, this water, anything could be poisoned.
2 people died, and the FBI came under intense pressure to find the killer. Later in the show, the murder of one of the silent screen's most respected directors and the long list of suspects who may have killed him.
She accidentally presses the very delicate trigger of a Smith & Wesson 38.
A man dies after taking 2 Excedrin capsules filled with cyanide. A Hollywood director is found shot to death. Our program looks at 2 famous murders, one of them solved, the other still considered flawless. First, the case of the Seattle grandmother known as the Black Widow, Stella Nickell. First poisoned her husband, then, when she thought she'd gotten away with murder, Nickell tried it again on a complete stranger. It set off a wave of hysteria that gripped an entire state.
Early on a bright June morning in 1986, in the Seattle suburb of Auburn, Washington, a local bank manager named Sue Snow went into her bathroom to finish getting ready for work. A few minutes later, her teenage daughter found her collapsed on the floor and called 911.
Within 10 minutes of the phone call, they had her on a helicopter to the medical center. I mean, it was that quick, and they were all mystified. They, tried to work miracles, but there was nothing they could do.
Emergency room doctors had no explanation for her sudden death. An autopsy was ordered by the King County Medical Examiner.
The assistant to the medical examiner is one of the small percentage of the population that can smell the bitter almond smell of cyanide. And she made the incision, and this faint odor wafted into her nose, and she said, "I smell almonds. Could it be?"
I confirmed it, and we notified the doctor, and she in turn ordered a cyanide test on the blood for the toxicology samples. And the results were positive for cyanide.
A bottle of extra-strength Excedrin recovered from Sue Snow's medicine cabinet was found to contain 8 capsules laced with lethal doses of cyanide.
Agents went to all the stores in South King County, gathering any type of Excedrin capsules they could find, so that we could box them up, send them back for analysis.
Within days, 2 more bottles containing cyanide were found on store shelves in the Auburn area.
It was a very weird thing to go through, this idea that anything that we're taking, we're drinking, this water, anything could be poisoned, and anybody could do it anonymously. There was somebody out there that had put cyanide, in headache remedies to kill somebody.
Suspicion fell on the man Sue Snow had recently married, Paul Webb King.
Paul was an interesting personality. He was an in-your-face type of guy. He was very calculating in the way he spoke. He didn't hem and haw. He didn't glaze over. He was just right at you.
In the emergency room, when they were looking at his wife and trying to figure out what could have happened to her, he said, well, maybe those headache pills she ate had been tampered with cyanide. I mean, he actually said that.
Webb King refused FBI requests to take a polygraph test until he realized he was their top suspect.
I remember when Paul came down to the FBI office to take the polygraph examiner. He was accompanied by his brother. He was trying to take kind of an authoritative lead and give us the reasons why Paul shouldn't take the polygraph exam. And Paul kind of stepped forward and said, "I'm taking it."
Webb King not only took the test, he passed it. Whoever was putting cyanide on drugstore shelves was still out there.
Auburn, Washington this morning, police...
There was tremendous news coverage, of course. And one woman said that she had seen that news coverage and she was worried about her husband.
The woman was Stella Nickell. Her husband Bruce had died a week before Sue Snow.
They had told her at the time of the autopsy at his death that he had died of emphysema, but she didn't believe it. And she said, "I have a bottle of Excedrin in my house with that same lot number that Sue Snow had. I think you need to come out here and check this out."
A search of Stella Nickell's home uncovered not one, but 2 Excedrin bottles that contained cyanide.
She said she bought these bottles at 2 different times. We thought maybe there was some mistake.
Out of all of Seattle, all of the bottles out there that had cyanide in them, one woman has 2 bottles in her house that she says she bought at 2 different places at 2 different times. What are the odds of that?
The coroner reopened the file on Bruce's death.
Bruce was buried and gone. He had willed his eyes to the Lion's Eye Bank. So they had little vial of blood that they have to keep at the time of the removal of the eyes.
They went back and analyzed the blood and determined that, yes, in fact, he had ingested cyanide and the dose was such that it would have caused his death.
When the lab took a closer look at the contaminated capsules, they found a tiny but possibly significant clue.
We received a call from the lab saying, "Hey, we're a little bit confused on the cyanide that we found in these bottles. There's this green substance and we don't know what it is."
The tiny green specks found mixed in with the cyanide were determined to be an aquarium product called Algae Destroyer. The FBI conducted a search of area pet stores to see if any carried the product.
We happened to stumble on an individual, Tom Noonan, who specifically remembered Stella.
Well, she was somewhat particular about the algicide she wanted to use. Stella preferred the effectiveness of the Algae Destroyer versus the product that we carry normally in the store. And it was at her request that I bring this product in so she could purchase it from our location.
Noonan not only made a link between Stella and Algae Destroyer, but offered a clue as to how it may have gotten mixed with cyanide.
One of the things I told her was a lot of times moisture would get in the blister packs and render the tablet somewhat ineffective, and you would drop the tablet in your aquarium and it would just sit there. Whereas if you crushed it up, it was more prone to dissolving and being effective as an algicide.
To help build their case against Stella Nickell, the FBI needed some way to find out more about her without arousing her suspicion. They chose neighbor Sandra Scott.
We took a chance on Sandra Scott. We told her where we were coming from. We asked her if she would keep an eye on Stella.
At that point in time, I didn't really think she had done it, but I would just as soon not have somebody that goes around poisoning people running around my neighborhood.
Sandra would occasionally stop by Stella's trailer for morning coffee.
She had a cup of coffee, I had a cup of coffee, I drank mine black. One of the things they wanted me to ask about was what she used to clean the algae out of her fish tank. That's kind of hard to work into a conversation. I said, "Boy, you don't have much algae in here for the amount of sunlight that your tank gets."
Stella said nothing about Algae Destroyer, but she did talk about her relationship with Bruce.
They kind of came together as a couple through a lot of partying. Bruce was a heavy drinker. Stella was a real partier. Stella liked this in the beginning. But after a while, this kind of wore on Stella, and so she put a lot of pressure on Bruce to quit drinking.
I don't think she knew how bad it was going to be once Bruce sobered up. And he just wanted to putter around the house and work on their mobile home and, ride their Goldwing motorcycles. That's all he wanted to do. Call his friends on the CB. I mean, that was their culture. That was their life. And Stella wanted nightlife. And she couldn't have that with him anymore once he stopped drinking.
In 1986, Bruce spent several months working in Alaska. An audio tape he sent to Stella revealed his own suspicions.
I just get kind of the feeling that something's not right at home. I don't know, it seemed like when I was talking to you there on the phone the other night, it just didn't seem like it was my wife that I was talking to. I felt like I was a stranger.
The FBI also uncovered a chilling motive behind the murder of Sue Snow. Through his job, Bruce had a life insurance policy that, in the result of accidental death, paid out an additional $100,000. Cyanide poisoning was considered accidental. Emphysema was not.
She needed to have that death certificate amended. She needed to find some way to get the world to notice that he had died of poisoning. She needed to prove that it was an accidental death to get that extra money.
She needed someone else to die. Only then could she get authorities to re-examine Bruce's death. So she filled 3 more bottles with cyanide and put them back on drugstore shelves. For months, Stella refused repeated requests to take a polygraph test.
They kept asking her, take one, it'll clear you, it'll exonerate you. And she would always say, I'm sick, I don't feel good, I love Bruce too much, it'll hurt, too much to relive it. You're making me live his death all over again.
But she couldn't collect on the insurance until the FBI cleared her as a suspect.
A few months later, Stella called our office. I think she's probably intoxicated, frankly. She said she wanted to take the polygraph test.
She was psyched up for it. She told her boyfriend at the time, I'm ready to get that monkey off my back today. I'm going down to Seattle, and I'm going to tell them like it is.
She came down, and I remember walking with Stella back to the polygraph room, and I remember her commenting, I feel like I'm walking into a lion's den.
When the test was over, Cusack confronted Stella with the results.
I said, hey, Stella, there's no doubt about it. I am positive you're responsible for Bruce's death. And she listened to us.
I just get kind of the feeling that something's not right at home. Something's not right at home. Something's not right at home.
And Stella didn't say a word. That's how calculating she was. And then she said, I want to talk to my attorney.
Stella walked out, leaving the FBI with a polygraph that they knew was inadmissible in court and a suspect who continued to insist that she was innocent.
I think for peace of mind, she started going around kind of shopping her program, her situation around to her neighbors.
She said she failed it. They asked her if she had taken pills out of the same bottle as the tainted pills came out of. And she told them no. And I said, but Stella, when I was down there the night before the FBI was at the house, you told me that your back had hurt so bad after driving back from Wenatchee that you had taken some out of the same bottle. And she, oh, I did? And I said, yeah. You don't remember that? No.
The person most shaken by the failed polygraph was Cindy Hamilton, Stella's 26-year-old daughter by her first marriage.
After the polygraph, after Stella came home and told Cindy, hey, I failed that polygraph, I think Cindy got scared and realized, you know something, I'm not going down with her. I'm going to go talk to what I know, and she did. Cindy Hamilton was a younger version of her mother in nearly every way. They had this odd sort of mother-daughter relationship where it's friend and friend kind of relationship and not mother and daughter. And so they would talk about, you know, the different men they were with, you know, and what they did with them and all this kind of gossipy kind of talk.
The year before Bruce's death, mother and daughter worked together screening baggage at Seattle's SeaTac Airport.
To kind of pass the boredom of these long days out at the airport, Stella started talking with Cindy on how the various ways in which they would get rid of Bruce. Stella was going to hire a hitman to come by and shoot him when he's driving home for work, but she said she couldn't get enough money for that. She was going to get a mechanic to undo the lug bolts on his car so maybe one of the front wheels would come off, put him into oncoming traffic. They talked about ODing him on cocaine, but to OD on cocaine, you have to have it in your system for a long time, so that wouldn't work. There was a plant that grew out on the property called foxglove. Cindy said that Stella loaded up some capsules and gave him this foxglove. And they kind of laughed about it because they said it was rather amusing that it didn't kill him, but he slept a lot for about 3 days, you know, and they thought this was a bit of a chuckle. So they talked about cyanide.
The main piece of evidence for Cindy, the turning point that she says kept clicking in her mind over and over, was a conversation she had with her mother right after Bruce died. And that was when Stella showed up at the friend's house. Cindy was there, and she said, "Bruce is dead." And Cindy said...
And Stella says right to her, "Cindy, I know what you're thinking, and the answer is no." And Cindy said she knew then for sure that her mother did it.
Cindy told agents that her mother had learned about cyanide at the local library.
We got a list and got the actual books that she had signed out and pulled anything on cyanide, got a subpoena and sent them back to the lab for analysis. There was a total of 104 latent fingerprints of Stella that were picked off of pages that had direct content of how to poison an individual.
On December 8, 1987, Stella was arrested and charged with murdering both her husband and Sue Snow. Her trial began in Seattle federal court in April of the next year. The star witness for the prosecution was her daughter Cindy, who later received a $200,000 reward for her testimony.
Stella was stoic throughout the trial, and she never admitted anything to anyone.
Stella Nickell became the first person in the U.S. to be convicted of product tampering. She was sentenced to 90 years in federal prison.
The murder of Bruce Nickell was a perfect crime. I mean, Stella got rid of her husband, no problem. She just didn't get the money she wanted.
In her greed for an extra $100,000 insurance payoff, Stella Nickell tried to get away with murder a second time and failed.
I guess murder sometimes is a gamble, and Stella threw the dice a second time to try to get that extra cash, and that was her biggest mistake.
A perfect crime is the unsolved crime. William Desmond Taylor was a famous silent film director during the 1920s. When he was found shot to death, America became riveted by the case, especially its lurid accusations of drug abuse, false identity, and blackmail. There was a large cast of suspects, but the killer was never caught. We continue with Perfect Crimes. the case of William Desmond Taylor.
In the early 1920s, the newly formed movie industry was America's most glamorous and profitable business. One of its most highly regarded directors was a 49-year-old Englishman named William Desmond Taylor.
Taylor was one of the top directors at Paramount. He had his own production unit, his own name above the title.
Well-educated, erudite, urbane, sophisticated, often found at home reading at night instead of out swilling illegal hooch, and was nicknamed the gentleman director.
But Taylor's place in the history of Hollywood changed dramatically on the cold morning of February 2nd, 1922, when Taylor's manservant, Henry Peavy, arrived for work.
He found it odd that the living room lights were already on. Mr. Taylor usually wasn't down that early. He walked in, and in the glow of the incandescent bulbs, he saw Taylor on the floor, dead. Peavy ran out of the bungalow into the courtyard and began screaming that Mr. Taylor was dead.
When the police arrived on the scene, there were various people all over the house.
The studio personnel were running around, making off with all-important letters, documents, possible evidence, bits of clothing, muddling the murder scene. The whole place was covered in fingerprints. You would never been able to tell one from another.
They were removing things because they didn't want anything unfavorable to reflect upon the dead man.
The one clue police were able to find came from Faith McLean, Taylor's neighbor. At about 8 o'clock the previous evening, she heard what she thought was a gunshot.
Seconds after the shot was fired, she went to her door, which is very close to Taylor's door, put her face to the screen, up against the screen door, and saw a man standing on Taylor's front doorstep.
In an overcoat with the collar turned up, or maybe a muffler around his neck, and a cap pulled down over his face. And this person was not panicked or fearful. As a matter of fact, when he saw Faith looking at him, he leaned back into Taylor's bungalow as if he was saying goodnight.
A conductor on a nearby trolley car claimed a man matching McLean's description boarded his car shortly after 8. When director William Desmond Taylor was found shot to death in February 1922, suspicion immediately fell on his former valet, Edward Sands.
He was an employee of Taylor's, and he worked as a cook, a valet, and secretary. Kind of an all-around man. He did a little bit of everything for Taylor.
The summer before the murder, Sands did something that wasn't in his job description.
Taylor went off to Europe and left the house in the hands of Sands, and it was during that period that Sands took the opportunity to forge some checks, several thousand in checks, and steal clothing and jewelry, and in fact Taylor's car, and hightail it out of town at that point.
Taylor filed charges, but by then Sands was long gone. In December 1921, a month before the murder, Sands made sure Taylor knew who'd robbed him.
He sent him a pawn ticket and had signed it Dean Tanner.
Police asked, who was Dean Tanner?
Within a few days of the murder, it was revealed that William Desmond Taylor was really someone else. someone named William Cunningham Dean Tanner, who had deserted a wife and child in New York in 1908 and had at that time changed his name.
He was a man born in Ireland. He came to the United States. He married, became an antique dealer, had a daughter, and disappeared and never heard from him again.
Tanner made his way to Los Angeles. Using the alias William Desmond Taylor, he got work as an actor. One of his early films, The Quakeress, made in 1912, still survives. By 1914, he had begun to make a name for himself as a director. But even to his closest friends, he kept his past a tightly guarded secret. Somehow Sands found out, and perhaps was using what he knew to blackmail his boss. When Taylor wouldn't give him what he wanted, Sands shot him. But one detail didn't fit.
Faith McLean said that she did not think the person she saw was Sands, and she knew Sands well, having seen him frequently during the time that he worked for Taylor.
If the mystery suspect wasn't Sands, who was it? A second theory involved the last person known to have seen Taylor alive.
Mabel Normand was a great star, a great comedian of the silent screen, and she and Taylor were very close. I believe that they were in love. I think he would have married her in a second, and he certainly had asked her to marry him on several occasions, but she was unable to commit.
Taylor spent the last evening of his life entertaining Normand in his home.
She had the bad luck to be the last person to see Taylor alive.
She had her chauffeur drive her over to Taylor's home, arrived about 7 o'clock in the evening, and then at about 7:45, she and Taylor walked out to her car at the curb.
She got in, she kissed the glass, kissed him goodbye. The lipstick print was on the glass. She went home. 5 minutes later, there was a shot.
Though police soon dismissed Normand as a suspect, they did uncover a darker side to her relationship with Taylor.
Drugs were everywhere. There was anybody who wanted it could get anything. It's sort of like there was the fast crowd and not so fast. The fast crowd all took drugs. Mabel was part of the fast crowd.
Taylor was very concerned about the drug gangsters in Hollywood and wanted to see them cleaned out of Hollywood.
He had confronted several of them, and in an aggressive sort of way, and at a time when it just wasn't the safest thing to do.
So according to this theory, the drug gangs decided to eliminate Taylor, to eliminate his interference in their business. So they hired a professional killer.
But the shadowy figure seen outside Taylor's door hardly behaved like a professional hitman. Police rounded up every underground figure they could lay their hands on, but weren't able to come up with a single shred of evidence to support the hitman theory. What they did uncover pointed them in an entirely different direction. When police searched Taylor's home after his murder, they found a pink nightgown and a love letter. The letter was from a 19-year-old actress named Mary Miles Minter.
She was a very prominent actress in the silent film industry and had one of the highest paying contracts, movie contracts worth over $1 million. It appears she developed a very severe, strong crush on him. In her mind, she was completely in love with him.
Taylor may have returned those affections, but the mother, Charlotte Shelby, quickly put an end to that.
Mary Miles Minter had an enormous salary that was controlled by Charlotte Shelby, her mother.
Charlotte Shelby would have lost a very large income if her daughter fell in love and married and kept her own money.
Shelby did everything in her power to keep Mary away from Taylor.
She was constantly invading his office, pulling out a hat pin, threatening him with it, threatening him with guns. She was a manic, crazy, over-the-top showbiz monster mother.
Charlotte Shelby had actually publicly said, if you come near my daughter again, I will shoot you.
One day, in the summer of 1920, Shelby openly accused Mary of being intimate with Taylor. Mary grabbed the family revolver.
She took the gun, rushed upstairs saying she was going to end it all. They heard gunshots, rushed into the room, and Mary was lying on the floor. She had her hand over her face and then moved her eyes and went, ha ha.
The gun was never located by police, but 15 years after the murder, bullets taken from it were found in Shelby's home.
The bullet which killed Taylor was identical to unfired bullets taken from Shelby's gun. So Shelby had a weapon identical to the murder weapon, if not the murder weapon itself.
On February 1st, 1922, the day before Taylor's body was found, Shelby and her daughter got into another heated argument over Taylor.
Shelby had overheard a phone conversation between Mary and Taylor that Mary was going to elope with Taylor that day.
Furious, Shelby locked Mary in her bedroom and stormed out of the house.
Charlotte Shelby stated that at the time of the murder, she was at the family mansion, that she was there with Carl Stockdale. He was a bit player, an actor. He certainly supported the alibi, but on the other hand, it was reported that Carl Stockdale received $200 a month from Charlotte Shelby for the rest of his life, and what was he being paid for?
At the time of the crime, Charlotte Shelby was never so much as questioned by police. Rumors spread that she was the person seen outside Taylor's door, dressed in men's clothing, and that she was paying off the local DA to secure her innocence. But in 1937, 15 years after the murder, Shelby stunned her accusers by publicly demanding that the allegations against her be heard before a grand jury. Prosecutors agreed to reopen the case. Mary testified, declaring to the jury that her mother was innocent. But then Shelby's older daughter, Margaret, took the stand. Though her secret testimony has never been released, she reportedly accused her mother of committing the murder and paying off the DA.
Margaret was accusing everybody of everything. Margaret was a raging paranoid and had suffered from extreme and severe paranoid delusions. She hated her mother because the mother was constantly crossing her in terms of money and everything else. And it would thrill her to think all those years later, well, many years later all this happened, that people would suddenly suspect her mother.
In the end, the grand jury neither indicted nor exonerated Charlotte Shelby. But one piece of forensic evidence in her defense was the unusual angle at which Taylor had been shot.
The shot was fired from a .38 caliber revolver. He was shot at very close range, within 1 or 2 inches from the body. The bullet entering the left side at about where the elbow would hang naturally.
The path of the bullet went up below this lower rib, passed up through the chest area, missing the heart and other vital organs, and almost exited at the neck.
It was found that the hole in Taylor's vest did not match the hole in the jacket unless the left arm was raised. So that led to speculation as to why was the left arm raised. Was he holding up his hands, or was his arm raised because he was embracing someone?
He was shot by a most short and unimposing person. That person would have had to be no more than 5 feet tall to aim the bullet at that special point. They'd also have to have been in a very tight embrace with the victim.
It's hard to conceive of how Charlotte Shelby would have gotten that close to Taylor and shot him at that angle.
Could she have got close to someone who hated her and she hated him to hold him in a deadly embrace? Impossible.
Perhaps the reason Shelby was so willing to face a jury was because she knew she was innocent, and she also knew who was guilty.
The only theory, I believe, that fits all the available facts is the following. For weeks, months, and over a year, Mary Miles Minter was trying desperately to get William Desmond Taylor either to make physical love to her, or better still, get him to promise her his hand in marriage.
There had been an incident where Mary Miles Minter had gone to Taylor's home late at night, had undressed and begged for his love, and Taylor had refused and sent her home. She wanted Taylor to be her white knight who would take her away from the evil witch of her mother. And when Taylor refused to do that, her frustration could have easily turned to rage.
Margaret testified that on the night of the murder, Mary escaped from the bedroom where her mother had locked her.
I don't believe she went there to kill him deliberately, but it happened. She took the gun to threaten him. She has that .38 Smith & Wesson in the long sleeve of her gown. She embraces him, begging him to make love to her. He doesn't. In the course of that embrace, she accidentally presses the very delicate trigger of a Smith & Wesson .38. He falls stunned to the floor. She's not sure what's going on. She's hysterical. She's trying to keep calm. She can't go to a doctor. She can't go to the police. What is she going to do? She stretches him out on that floor and prepares him.
The body was found not collapsed on the floor, but carefully laid out, as if for a funeral.
There were 3 strands of blonde hair which were found on Taylor's body, supposedly under the lapel of his jacket. Investigators had that hair taken and compared with hair taken from Mary Miles Minter's hairbrush, which was taken from the studio, and they were found to be identical.
According to her sister Margaret, Mary returned home around 8:30 that evening, nervous and upset. The only other witness to whatever it was that Mary may have said or done that night was their maid, Belle Simpson. 1 year later, Charlotte Shelby had her committed to a state mental asylum. Simpson later told relatives that she was in trouble because of something she knew about the murder. She remained in the asylum until her death 39 years later. 42 years after Taylor's murder, in another part of Hollywood, neighbors rushed to the aid of an elderly woman who had collapsed in her home. While they waited for the ambulance to arrive, she revealed to them a secret she had never told another living soul.
She then went on to relate that she had been a silent screen performer during the 1910s and 1920s. And she went on to say that she had shot and killed a William Desmond Taylor.
An hour later, she was dead. The only clue she left was an aging steamer trunk.
On opening it, we found it was filled with theatrical stills.
Ray Long recognized the youthful face of his elderly neighbor and began a 5-year quest to uncover her hidden past. Long discovered that both she and William Desmond Taylor had worked in Denver, Colorado theaters as early as 1910. By 1911, both were working as actors in Hollywood. They even starred together in 4 films. In 1918, Gibson, at age 28, was finding it hard to get work playing innocent young women. In an effort to reinvent herself and revive her career, she changed her name to Patricia Palmer. But good parts were still few and far between. In early 1921, she got work on a serial western, Rounding Up the Law. It was filmed on the Paramount lot.
That would have afforded Patricia Palmer the opportunity to observe at very close range the relationship between Mary Miles Minter and William Desmond Taylor.
Perhaps an old jealousy was rekindled. Perhaps Taylor's final embrace and the blonde hairs left on his collar were clues that ultimately lead to a spurned woman's broken heart.
Hell hath no fury as a woman scorned, and I suspect that was one of the reasons or one of the motives for the killing.
In the 1960s, another famous director, King Vidor, investigated Taylor's murder and considered making a film about the case. Vidor concluded that the guilty party was Charlotte Shelby, the domineering mother of Mary Miles Minter. But there's still not a single theory that explains both the path of the bullet and the mysterious man seen outside William Desmond Taylor's door. In this case, someone did get away with a perfect crime.